Whoever you are, whatever the weather, for what it's worth, hello. I once had to stand up and testify to a jury. True story, this. As part of my degree, I had to collect evidence from a staged crime scene, do loads of science on that evidence, and then present a report. Under oath, my testimony was cross-examined and my methods were ruthlessly scrutinized. It was daunting. Even though I secretly wished for some natural disaster to bring me and all proceedings to an end, I figured I'd do well because I knew I was telling the truth. I did not do well. I sucked at defending myself, even in this mock courtroom scenario. The truth does not always prevail. What let me down was not the facts, but the rhetoric. How I argued my case was perhaps more important than the conclusions I was presenting. Clearly, communication isn't an exact science. It's a little hit or miss, fraught with deceit, subtext, vagaries, and misunderstandings. Songs have been written about this. Turning thoughts and feelings into words is a wondrous thing, but humanity has not come close to perfecting it. Even more fun, we have to accept that the message itself may be untrue, inconsistent, esoteric, or deliberately misleading. Nobody is ever fully equipped to deal with this. But there are ways to improve. It's time we learnt to identify, name, and refrain from using some very common logical mistakes in how people argue their case. Studying forensic science at university taught me how to assess an environment, decide what's important, methodically investigate, and eventually find my shoes without waking anyone up. What university didn't teach me was how to explain what I knew, how to debate subjects convincingly, or how to spot flaws in the arguments of others. I consider this a failing. Gathering information from both sides of a discussion and letting the stronger argument persuade you may be the only way to form a robust opinion. While I'm very much still learning in this regard, I have discovered that knowing a few logical fallacies can be profoundly helpful. A little explanation. Say I know this guy. His name is Fox. His younger sister disappeared when he was a child, and no trace of her was ever found. That sucks. So Fox spent the rest of his life believing that aliens were behind his sister's abduction. He'd rather believe that his sister was still alive somewhere out amongst the stars than accept that she's probably dead. An understandable but dubious position to take. Now, if you question Fox's conclusion, he might reply, "Well, would you rather my sister was dead?" Yikes! This response is very difficult to argue against, because saying yes would make you seem heartless. Saying no tricks you into agreeing with him. By creating this false dichotomy, Fox's remark leaves logic at the door in an attempt to trap you. Though we probably shouldn't be too harsh on him given the circumstances. It wasn't the best example. Logical fallacies, as they're officially called, are everyday inconsistencies in the way people think, and they've been around as long as philosophy. Still, being able to spot the error in a person's claim is as useful today as it was in ancient Greece. We all need protection against iffy ideas, misinformation, and the dubious arguments of politicians, advertisers, and social media icons. In a world that celebrates and perpetuates oceans of bunk, staying one step ahead may reduce your chances of being unfairly exploited, discredited, or duped. Don't you worry, Wiggle Soup has your back. What follows is a quick-fire who's who in the world of bad arguments. Most are pretty easy to grasp and fun to spot once you get the hang of them. I promise you will encounter these everywhere, not just when you're put on trial. Tu quo que. A man sucks on a fat Cuban cigar, leans in close to you, blows smoke in your face and tells you never to take up smoking because the habit is very bad for your health. It might seem relevant, but the fact that someone is a hypocrite doesn't invalidate their point. It's a common tactic to deflect attention away from an argument by pointing out that an opposition's behaviour is inconsistent with their claim. This may be true, but it doesn't invalidate their point. How often have we heard, "Yes, I lied, but so did you, so you can't judge me"? Tu quo que literally means you too. This, my friends, is not a logical argument. Redistributing the blame or simply returning the accusation doesn't absolve your guilt. It merely adds red herrings to the fire. Appeal to the bandwagon. The thinking here is that if many people believe in something, it must therefore be true. Look at all the people who believe in life after death. They can't all be wrong. It's actually a logical fallacy to argue that because something has a majority vote, that somehow validates the claim. Human sacrifice never affected crop yields, no matter how many people believed it, or for how long. Popularity does not make something true or untrue. Empirical evidence does. Can we all agree on that, please? The slippery slope. Society is not built on a tightrope. New ideas don't risk us all falling into a pit of destruction. Yet, people often argue this way in support of the status quo. They say, if we legalize same-sex marriage, then next people will be marrying their pets, and farm animals, and electronic devices. Or they might say, if we comfort our baby every time she cries, then we'll spoil her. She'll grow up without limits and end up in prison. You might hear, if we let this student redo her test, then all students will expect retakes every year and deadlines will lose all meaning. For goodness sake. Concocting a sequence of worsening events creates an unrealistically bleak scenario, and one that is much harder to argue against than the actual thing we're discussing. A rational conversation has been tactically sidestepped, and now we have to defend some fictional dystopia instead. Don't fall for this. Whatever next? False cause. Correlation does not imply causation. For example, we've all noticed how global temperatures are rising and that the oceans are being dramatically overfished. Obviously, fish must control the global temperature. Crowing roosters do not trigger the sun to rise. Noticing a smell when I enter the room does not instantly make me the culprit. And, by the way, that St. Christopher pendant contributed nothing to your personal safety while travelling. The fallacy is properly called post hoc ergo propter hoc, Latin for after this, therefore because of this. It's the logical fallacy that answers your prayers. Ad hominem. Speaking as a specialist in absolutely nothing, I hear ad hominem arguments all the time. Someone might say, well, what do you know about relationships? You're single. Or, when you're a dietitian, then you can tell me what's healthy. Instead of focusing on the validity of points being made, attacks on a person's credibility aim to discredit everything they say by extension. Believe it or not, it is perfectly possible for a celibate monk to offer good parenting advice. Simply disrespecting somebody doesn't alter the validity of their arguments. But what do I know? An appeal to authority. Taking ad hominem to the opposite extreme, if a respected figure says something is true, it must be true, right? The fact that we can all point to a doctor, or a scientist, or a Kardashian, or a film star who agrees with us shows that any claim can be true or false, regardless of who makes it. First-hand accounts from industry experts definitely strengthen your case, but they're not watertight arguments on their own. Claims coming from famous non-experts are even weaker. Appeals to authority ignore the possibility of human error and conflicts of interest. Yet, products endorsed by celebrities still sell like George Clooney's trademark hotcakes. Personal incredulity. It's amazing to think that all life shares a common ancestor, that time runs slower at your head than it does by your feet, and that matter and energy are essentially the same thing expressed in different ways. But it's true. These things can be proven beyond reasonable doubt, if not demonstrated. There is nothing wrong with questioning the data or the underlying assumptions. But if your only basis for disbelief is an intuitive unease with the concept, you don't have a leg to stand on. It's like saying, I can't see how humans could have built the pyramids. There's just no way. What a person feels ought to be possible is baseless if it's not supported by evidence. Personal incredulity is an argument from ignorance on a personal level, and I just can't see how anyone could disagree with that. A straw man. Any vote for legalizing marijuana is a vote for a nation of drug addicts. Chill, dude. Painting a simplistic, distorted, ridiculous version of the opposition's argument shouldn't make your proposal look stronger. But it does. This is a sly, wool-over-the-eyes type tactic, similar to a slippery slope, as it makes the target much harder to defend. You really think that the universe just popped into existence one day, by accident, and that the human race evolved from pond scum? This kind of straw man argument works wonders with crowds because people tend to equate something that's funny with something that's false. Once an opponent has deliberately and comically mischaracterized your idea, it's hard to gently educate people back towards the actual point you were making. Be strong. Calmly exposing the strategic misunderstanding can be all you need to unpick a straw man. A false dichotomy. You might have guessed, if there's something I don't know, it's probably not worth knowing. When things are presented as black or white, either or, for or against, a dichotomy is created, an argument with only two sides. Someone's point of view can be strengthened if the proposed alternative appears faintly ludicrous. Imagine someone claiming, if we cut taxes, then crime will skyrocket. To defend yourself, point out that there are always multiple middle grounds between two extremes. Eating fresh vegetables or getting terribly sick are not the only two possibilities. Claiming that if you don't like Shakespeare, then you can't appreciate literature does not reflect reality, and being an atheist and being moral are not mutually exclusive. Pointing out the exceptions to a supposed dichotomy sweep this fallacy aside. The fallacy of composition. What is true of the whole need not be true of its parts, and vice versa. For example, your house might be twice the size of mine, but that doesn't mean that its doors are twice as big. Similarly, atoms are invisible, and I am made of atoms, so I must be invisible too. This is not the case, except maybe at parties. The thinking also applies to groups. It's an error to assume that what's true of an individual is also true of all members of the group they belong to. Saying, "My neighbour does so much for charity. She's a Virgo. Virgos are such nice people," may appear harmless, but sadly, this logical fallacy is what creates sweeping generalizations, stereotypes, racism, and prejudice. It's a good one to avoid. An argument from ignorance. So, because I can't prove that I'm not dreaming right now, I must be asleep. Many things cannot be falsified. The Loch Ness Monster, alien intelligence, the Illuminati, etc. But absence of evidence is not evidence of anything. We can't assume that something is true because it hasn't been proven false yet, nor the reverse. These claims do not make for very strong arguments, but they do inspire good stories. Bro. False equivalence. Finding an attribute that two things have in common doesn't mean that the two things are essentially the same. As all cats are fluffy and playful, a tiger would make an excellent pet. Or, more insidious, some scientists believe in reincarnation and some don't, so the consensus is a stalemate. It's not smart to assume equal likelihood of all competing opinions. Presenting two sides as balanced makes extreme beliefs look credible. It would be like saying the captain of the Titanic should be regarded no differently to any other mass murderer in history. A single shared property doesn't mean that both cases should be given the same consideration. Life is regrettably far less tidy. Beware all who enter false equivalence. Circular arguments. My mum's quiche is so good because she's the best cook. We can have a lot of fun with circular arguments, when a premise is so ingrained it's taken to be self-evident and unquestionable. As the name suggests, these logical fallacies go around in circles. Roald Dahl was a great children's author because he wrote so many books that children love. When a premise has the same meaning as its conclusion, the entire argument is overlooked. They totally sidestep the question, why? Someone saying, "You should pay me more money because I deserve a pay rise," is like saying, "It's okay to punch someone if you're angry because angry people are violent." These statements beg the question, why is that then? People become trapped if they use circular reasoning to justify a belief, never thinking to doubt the underlying assumption. Jesus is the saviour of mankind because he died for our sins. Enough said. Appeal to consequences. Imagine you had a housemate who had far too much to drink and drove home in an intoxicated state. He didn't get pulled over by the police, didn't hit any other vehicles or pedestrians, and guided his car into the garage without damaging it or himself. All's well that ends well, right? Wrong. The fact that events played out okay doesn't mean that it was ever a good idea. Someone who claims otherwise is making a logical error. For exactly the same reason, something ending in disaster doesn't necessarily mean it was the wrong thing to do at the time. potentially life-saving medical procedures go fatally wrong every day. The outcome alone can't be used to justify or condemn an action. It's always nice to think that your personal beliefs can be supported without resorting to clever trickery. But, if not, logical fallacies can also be employed to strengthen your case. You only need to sound logical to charm the hearts and minds of your audience, even if your points are actually hollow or irrelevant. Cleverly concealed, dodgy assumptions can win the day, as long as pride, sportsmanship, and the truth remain optional for you. This was another thing that my degree never taught me. Just because you want to believe something doesn't make it true. It's not a logical fallacy per se, more a cognitive bias, though Mulder had a poster and everything. Thinking back to my public flogging as an expert witness, my mistake was to assume that something being true makes it believable. It doesn't. People still need to be convinced, persuaded, brought around, and modern science can be notoriously hard to grasp. In my defense, although I had presented my case badly, failed to explain what my experiments showed, and probably made several logical fallacies along the way, none of that proved that my conclusions were false. To claim so would be making the fallacy fallacy, but you try telling a jury that. A basic grasp of logical fallacies sure feels empowering. But before you don your cape and take to the rooftops, hoping to cleanse the world of bad arguments, let's first get our own logical hygiene under control. Next up, I want to talk about introspection.